Okay, so this is the 100 books I read in 2021. I'm just gonna do this on my phone, evidently, because I can't really. Well, I can't do it with the other camera, but obviously better quality. But at the same time, you have to deal with having to like negotiate with the lighting and all the different kind of theatrics and different elements. And it's basically just easier if I do this, so I don't have to worry about the battery dying mid sentence and threading it together later. But anyway, so hopefully this won't be as long. Obviously, well, just obviously not going to be this as quite as big as the 151 video that I did. I think I have to split that in two, three parts maybe. But anyway, so in 2021 January, I read Beyond the Pleasure Principle by Sigmund Freud. Um, I think that's the only thing of Freud I've yet to actually read Interpretation of Dreams. But I also kind of knew that heard that Freud was kind of hard to parse out and understand, like all that psychoanalytic language. But I do like what he had to say about Beyond the Pleasure Principle. I think it was more succinct, and it was only it was a pretty big essay, I guess. But, obviously it was like a few hours to finish at least. But it was like um, he basically pauses to that, like there's more to, like, it's the pleasure principle. Like he thought that before then everybody did everything based on like a hedonic kind of principle of um whatever gains the most pleasure out of the situation in favor of pain. But then he realized that there were certain patients he had that were so especially kind of more like mentally far gone kind of people that were so like with psychopathy and all that, where they would be so fixated beyond, like on destroying themselves as like a weird thing of like just like completely obliterating like their, and it made no sense. So like that's what made him think, because this is what he called the death drive, I think, and that's what you kind of hear is the term that was like attributed to Freud as well. But I just thought that was interesting because I heard that term before being thrown around, and I was like, "What's a death drive?" And I was like, "Oh, it's Freud." So like I looked him up, looked into it, and obviously I also read a bunch of other stuff by Carl Jung before that. I've yet to read Adler yet, or the stuff by Otto Rank, but those are different things that you'll see throughout a lot of these. You'll see like sprinkled in there, like philosophical kind of things, and then psychological related uh, books as well. So the description of a struggle and other stories by Franz Kafka. Kafka. I've heard it both ways. But you say banana, you say tomato, I say tomato. So description of a struggle is Kafka's first novel or work he ever made. I think short story, and then there's other stuff. Yeah, I heard it. I like looking through his bibliography. I'm trying to slowly work my through that, and like Dostoevsky's, and like you always find these little things, or at least I do, that I was like, wait a second, I haven't heard of this yet, or I haven't read this yet, and it's like just a tad bit one of those things that I'd very much like to get under my belt. Like it doesn't really make sense. Like I don't need to um, finish, or I don't need to read everything, but I do kind of just to say that I holistically kind of went through everything that Kafka made. But at the same time, I also know I know that's impossible, because like there's probably stuff that he wrote that probably never made the light of day. And I know that Max Brod, his literary executioner slash executor, would take these things, so much of his stuff that Kafka, he might have said this in a moment of kind of despair rather than serious kind of, that he wanted all, they requested that he get all of his writings burned by his best friend Max Brod. But then obviously he didn't listen to him, and it's like one of those things where it's like that's a classic kind of, it's almost become a trope nowadays of the art, letting the art live on in the world against the artist's objections, and you're like, oh, well, it's for the betterment, it's become so good. And it's like almost like consequentialism, in a sense, like you're saying that the ends justify the means, because you're you're not listening to, but you at the same time though, description of struggle is, I think this is before Kafka found his style, so you're hearing a lot. It's like an interesting kind of thing of like this guy walking down the street and he's like, I guess he's following a tenant, somebody at a bar, I think. One of the patrons of a bar is leaving, I think, and he's like, someone inebriated, or both of them are, I think, and then he starts following him down. It's been like, like I said, it's been like 3 years since I read it, but he starts following him down the street, and he's trying to, I guess, like, he starts, like, at some point, taking on, like, a kind of surreal momentum, and then takes, like, the guy on his shoulders, I guess, and then that's why there's actually a statue, I think, I don't know if it's in Prague, or it might be in, I think, where Kafka's hometown, where he was uh, born. I think there's a statue of a guy with with another guy on his shoulders. So yeah, that's kind of one of the, like, I don't know if that's the titular description of a struggle, but I just thought it was pretty interesting. Okay, so The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, I think is pronounced, who was obviously, like, it's a pretty well known book. It's been described as children's book too, and it is definitely the length and the kind of written in a way that children can be easily access it without having to worry too much about digesting super big, but like at the same time the themes are so actually pretty intense too, like this idea of this little prince, this young little boy, asking all these big kind of pressing questions of like why does this man, is this what we're meant to grow up to be, like someone like obsessing over figures and numbers and this idea of just going on an airplane and just kind of freeing, totally free, all these colorful descriptions that I really like. And it's like it's harkening back to this symbolic idea of like just childhood and innocence, very childlike, not childish. It's not immature, it's not, but it's more so like in a very, very like unique way of poking kind of, or like pointing out the hypocrisy of just being like this whole idea of like you basically graduate from a good school, you maybe prep school or whatever, and then you basically, depending on your class and status, you basically just end up going to a job and work until you're dead, and then you don't think about anything else. And that's kind of what like it was the antithesis to what the attitude of the Little Prince was. And yeah, that's and yeah, and Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was also a pilot as well, so it's semi-autobiographical. Obviously, there's a lot of creative, he takes liberties and on how he describes a lot of his what he sees, but like in the world, like he's like blends the fantasy with what he actually saw. And yeah, he's died pretty young too. I'm not sure if it was like a plane crash that happened. I'm not entirely sure, but obviously the technology wasn't as good for aircraft in those days in the 1940s. So, Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk. I think it's Chuck Palahniuk. Yeah, Palahniuk. And the name's Paula in Nick, I think. At least that's what I've heard people say. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else can be said. It's just postmodern, unreliable narrator starting right in the middle of the story. Kind of, there's nothing else to be said. I did find it. I've heard it. Fight Club is like people have did so many different, both the movie and the book, just so many different reviews and analyses. And I feel like I don't really have anything else to say, but I do, I did find this kind of fairly, when I was like a young man, like going through, 1920, like I remember watching the movie a number of times. I didn't read, obviously I didn't read the book till a lot later, but I do remember it kind of showing the dangers of completely just playing, your shadow side, and again Jungian psychology too, is that I think this kind of got me a little bit. I think it piqued my interest in Carl Jung as well when I first saw the movie, because I heard people mention him, like this whole, Tyler Durden is the shadow of, all the different traits of that the narrator repressed, and like the narrator is so almost like an unnamed kind of just passing through life observer. He had, like, in this, very just kind of jaded and cynical about everything, just passing by and just kind of consuming, yet being detached from all the stuff that he was, and just like completely, Tyler Durden, he kind of creates this, classic kind of, I've heard, I've seen that kind of thing with like this, Tyler Durden being the, hallucinate, basically dreamt up in like a schizophrenic narrator's not mind, but at the same time, I've seen this, exact same thing with like The Double too, is like kind of like it deals with similar themes of somebody in your likeness coming along, but obviously it's not with The Double. It was like a different kind of thing. I think I did a review, but interesting. Yeah, definitely. Really, not sure what to make of that. But yeah, The Master and the Margarita, Mikhail Bulgakov, definitely one of my favorites up there. There's lots of magic realism, fantasy, Manuscripts Don't Burn. I did a review of it. Definitely one of my favorite magic realist books. And then there's Antkind by Charlie Kaufman. I remember actually pre-ordering it when I first heard about it, because I was like kind of in the know slightly. I was like, hey, Charlie Kaufman's writing a book, yay. And it was like, people described it as semi-Kafka-esque and with a bit of like a Beckett type absurdity, and I was like, yep, sign me up. So but I didn't, it wasn't until, until, because it came out 2020, I think, but until like 2021 that I actually read it. But I was also kind of scared of taking it on, because I was also reading like Infinite Jest back in 2020 for the first time too, so I wanted to kind of space out the different kind of big books as well. And now I'm just like I'm just buying all these different big books, like, Roberto Bolaño's 2666, and I think it's called Francisco Pessoa's, I think, what was the name of it? I have someone, but it's that that's another kind of similarly sized tome that I don't know why I keep saying. I don't know why I keep signing myself up for these torturous books. Anyway, so that was all I read for January. Then February I read Ethics by Spinoza, philosophical tome, or I'm sorry, dissertation kind of like works by art that have also been around, for like a good 300-400 years. I think Spinoza was from 17th century, early 17th. So he's definitely, almost contemporaries with Descartes. He was a part of the rationalists. Recently watched like a pretty good documentary on Spinoza, just to kind of brush up on his stuff, because ethics, he pretty much, a lot of people say that, his idea of like the god, Spinoza's god, or Einstein's, Einstein believing in the god of Spinoza, which is like a panentheistic, which means that pan means all, obviously. Greek root is, meaning that it's not to be confused with pantheism. Pantheism means many gods, theist, or deism is, I think, is like, you believe in this kind of separate god, right? It's like something that Thomas Jefferson, and like some of the founding fathers, I think, believed in. They were like all kind of like Enlightenment runoff kind of ideals. And then there's ethics in Spinoza, I think, with that pantheistic god, is basically the god is like implicit in the rational and natural order of like the universe, like a bit like Plato's forms, in the sense that there's like, Plato believed that there was just like some other thing that was thing in itself, I guess you could say, in a Kantian way of being, that you couldn't possibly understand. Like the thing in itself is like something independent of all our senses. Like if you turn off, if everybody died today, like this thing would go on. Like it would just, um, and people have argued about that too. Like I think Schopenhauer, it was a started out as a Kantian, but then he's kind of disagreed. I think on contended with this point. I think just a little bit. But yeah, I think with Spinoza, it's like it seems like a little bit like his ethics are um, rooted in something that it's like we all have things we do that because it's like in our best interest, like the way we treat each other, like we don't steal, we don't do anything, but because it's not in our best interest, it's not, it's like in the way that we don't go say we don't purposefully. I think I thought of this. I didn't invent this. Obviously, I think maybe part of it might have said something to this effect. But I think um, there's a part. There's a little thought experiment I remember thinking of some time back of like what is the reason for why none of us, or at least little to none of us, actually go just driving off the road when we're driving a car, or why don't we purposely put ourselves in danger? It's because not only is it not in our best interest, it's not in the best interest of anyone else, and I think that's our natural kind of conscious innate desire for the most part. 'Cause, if it's not inborn in us, I guess blank slate, like, or opposite to a blank slate, then it's probably nurtured in us over time for us to all kind of be cool and not damage each other purposely. But I also realize that there are people that don't really have that. They don't really think through, and they're just like impulsive. Not that I think there is maybe a kind of Freudian kind of that classic kind of id part of us, the primitive subconscious part that just wants to, I don't know, sow discord and be, like, there's a part of us, there's part of me too, and it might not seem it, that isn't really mindful or thoughtful and wants to just kind of act impulsively, caustically, without any, you know, any insinuation or thought or and into how that might reflect yourself tomorrow. Like you don't really, and a lot of us kind of we try to put on kind of like this persona to the world, and that's like, it's constructed and might be facile. It might be, some of us might just be naturally like that, and some of us have to work for that. Like some of us, this is a Nagel, I think, talked about this, Thomas Nagel, where look, we all have different playing routes. Like it's not interesting in John Rawls sense, because we all think we all have, what's it called, a veil of ignorance, right? We all come into the world with a certain measure of ignorance in how this whole world of like politics and like discourse and culture is. Like we all have this, and if we're all going to be like good, responsible citizens and egalitarian, and be, and try to pave the way and make justice this inherent thing, like, and not just a kind of Socratic ideal where we're like, what is justice? And you keep going back and forth in the dialogues, for example, Platonic dialogues, then I think like you have to, because there's a part of us too that has a, I'm not sure, like some people are just naturally not sociable, or they don't, or gregarious, they're not giving people, they're not generous to other people. So like what do you do with this type of people? Do you like nudge them in? It's like Dostoevsky's underground man. Anyway, so I didn't know I'd get off that far. I just thought that interesting idea of like kind of how people kind of are on a baseline level. Like how do we make a society that actually not placates them, but not like doesn't necessarily like doesn't provoke them or force them, but like makes it possible for all of us to get along, but not in too elusive an anarchic way. But and for some it might have been a form of Christian, like Tolstoy was like a form of Christian anarchy, where you just completely deny yourself in an ascetic kind of way, and you very almost eerily similar to the Buddhists as well. I think even like, I think, didn't Gandhi meet Tolstoy? I think very old Tolstoy. I think so. I might have to check that. But anyway, so The Fall by Albert Camus. I remember this taking place in the Netherlands, and the narrator, in a classic Camus kind of sense, is like detached and like reminded me at first a little bit like The Stranger, but I don't remember else from that because I remember this kind of going over my head for the most part, and I had to like listen to other people's takes on it, and I was like, he had a like, didn't he have like main character in the Fall was like basically trying to have this very elaborate like divulging type of conversation with another stranger. I'm not sure if he was like drunk or not, but it might have not really mattered. But it was just this idea of like him, some random kind of like a little bit off his rockers kind of guy, just in a bar, just gave me an interesting image, like kind of dark and like And I think the reason it was called The Fall is because this idea, because in the Netherlands, like the way this the way the streets are like kind of like very not really symmetrical, but like you just look at the from a bird's eye view, not even a bird's eye view, but just like kind of like how. I mean, I've passed through the Netherlands and like an airport on my way to Sweden, but yeah, I'd definitely like to go and just walk through all of Holland and the the Netherlands and all that, just like. But yeah, it's like just the way it looked, kind of. I think that and just the fall, like this idea of somebody falling. I think it was very kind of almost a biblical sense, but like mixed with a kind of modern kind of metropolitan type of area. Yeah, those are. I gotta look. I gotta reread. You can tell. Um, but I keep mixing it up because I read The First Man, I think, as well, which has another biblical kind of thing with like interesting that imagery as well. Poor Folk by Dostoevsky. Yeah, it took me that long to read Poor Folk. It took me almost 5 years since I first started reading Dostoevsky to finally just clamp down and read it, because I kept hearing like that was like what kind of introduced him to literary fame, and that circle and different people made him kind of a well respected kind of author in a especially since it was it's a kind of short novel, almost novella, on the cusp of novel and novella, and it's like The Double. It's like has a similar size, and it's like I think published the same year. They're kind of like two very different kind of novels. Like one of them is like an epistolary, meaning that epistolary kind of novel, which means that it takes place with letters to one another, and it has what is it? Someone Mr. something Devushkin, I think, Devushkin, and he's like a distant cousin that he has really fancies though, and like I think he's like a third cousin, like once removed or something, and I can't remember her name. Paulina, I think, started with a P, and very like a very affectionate, endearing kind of quality of these two, just like abjectly poor, just like connected by their misery. I'm sorry, connected by their poverty. They're just like very, just like trading, stories and jokes and all that, and they're just trying to make their way day by day, and that's what really bonds them. And it's just like it's an image of like Russia at a certain time, of just like when poverty was so just like almost prevalent, so like in a strange way where like nobody could really escape it. And I think like Dostoevsky, upper middle class kind of, but he was very much in tune to like what was going on with this whole thing. And Freud comes up again, because Freud talked about patricide, like the killing of one's father, and this idea that Dostoevsky's father. I really am not like a Freudian at all. I've only read literally just that one book, but like he just keeps showing up just because I've heard kind of obliquely reading different articles about Dostoevsky, and like Freud's take shows up quite a bit. So with like the serfs basically murdered him, Dostoevsky's father. And there's a bit of a thing with like this theme of guilt showing up like a lot. Like you'll hear about excuse me, it's the cat tries me. I'm just gonna keep this going. But yeah, the theme of guilt and like conviction shows up a lot, because like Dostoevsky's father might not have been the best person in the world. He was like I think a bit of a drunk. a bit of user maybe. I'd have to like look more into that, but I think this idea was that Dostoevsky wasn't too big on his father and like was like it was almost as if the serfs were acting out something that he was like thinking was like just in a way, and then there's this weird way that um you get like secondhand embarrassment or like guilt and like stuff like that. Like you get all that. You start you to accumulate it and feel that kind of and if you don't say it like because again conscious does so much like if you don't physically say it like I'm like in voice he sings that it will show in different ways like it shows up in his writing and other ways too. Anyway, so A Season in Hell by author Rambo. Very celebrated poet. Like definitely was he one of the I want to say like the French symbolists were kind of around where he was a part of that French symbolist. And I know Paul Valery and Forlani I keep getting mixed up, but I think one of them had like a romantic affair with Arthur Rimbaud. And I think Rambo is such a like prodigious or precocious student. Like he was very like he wrote like his like first like book of poems. I think like it was Illuminations. I think which I might have read that too. I think I did read Illuminations. But I think he did that like when he was literally a teenager, like late teens. I think. Um, it was just very proficient and like in social circles and like he was like celebrated. But then there was another part to Rimbaud, which was like very again like going with these like psychoanalysis kind of things, but like he was very um there was a quote to his mother where he was saying like because he grew up in a Christian background, he grew up in like a kind of I don't know if it's like a Lutheran kind of church, um but yeah, very generously Christian kind of um background, and he basically you know pushed that aside, and he was like saying to his mother that like I'm trying to debase myself in the highest form and just basically purposely do it. Like he was like saying like I don't know why I do all these sick things, I don't know why I tell you, or that I go off and have an affair with this guy that's twice my age. This poet, kind of peer, kind of role model of mine, but also like I'm like he was like very the way he kind of dictated it. Like you don't see that a lot. It's just weird or interesting. I don't know how weird I'd say it was, but it might have been like more kind of um it might have been less taboo during the time, but I definitely think they're like his output was like it was like a like the old adage of like the candle that burns twice as brightly burns out twice as quickly. So like he like went through all that kind of like he was like even saying like haha, look, isn't this so cliche that I'm doing this kind of thing and engaging in all this kind of decadence. That's what it is. Decadent is the weird. And it's not like a necessarily bad thing, decadence. And I do know Nietzsche and other people. I'm sure like if Dostoevsky kind of lived longer, he would have probably had something to say about the movement itself. But the decadent art movement is like there's just like the key thing is like if you look that movement up is like this young lady like just raw, just like completely spread. I can't think of any better word than spread eagle. Like just like spread out on like this bed and sheets or like on a pillow or something. She's just like somewhat reading a book, kind of half asleep. That is kind of just the idea of just kind of excess. I think excess, but like in a almost ironical way. I mean, Oscar Wilde was he engaged in that kind of movement as well, and you know I think too like the picture Dorian Gray was a decadent novel in the sense that it was just like flashy and flamboyant and ostentatious and showy, just like um very much just kind of uh everything is so over the top and colorful, and I think in that sense like if there's something with Arthur Rimbaud's like he lived this life and basically it was like burned out, and then he didn't have anything, and then he basically went out I don't know if he really gambled his money away, but he did. I I think he did go back to working this like kind of like it was like a kind of contract kind of thing, kind of blue collar work for the day. Surprisingly, because he was like from a pretty kind of rich family, I think, lineage. And he also, but he basically um, worked to this kind of low end job just to kind of get away from him, like all his talents and stuff, because he was kind of haunted by that. Yeah, interesting figure. I've got to read more about him though. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Obviously, that's one of those school kind of required reading things that I never actually got somehow in my curriculum. I'm not sure why. I did get Orwell and Mark Twain and all that kind of standard stuff. And like To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee and all that. And yeah, I think I was like, oh well, maybe I should finally read this, and I did. And then it was like, like it's been accused of being a little bit too on the nose. Like these are all the like what was the stuff that like the characters like it was like this drug kind of thing, like the stoma I think it was called, or the sting. It was like the Stemia or something like that. It was like Soma something, or I can't remember exactly the name, but it's basically this idea of like perfectly made genetic, eugenics is like in place, in this dystopian society. And I did think like the thing with like the Savage character, I think it was called like they called him just the Savage John or something. I did think that was a bit like kind of on the nose, and like how everyone else was like, ew, he's so like unorthodox and like weird and bizarre looking because he wasn't like them, and that was very telling. But it was also a bit on the nose. And Huxley's been accused of being kind of a little bit, like kind of like mentioning certain things like Shakespeare, and like kind of playing on that, and like characters reading Shakespeare, and just like trying to, but in this almost as a people have like accused him of being like slightly like intellectually lazy in that sense, just because he's like mentioning these highfalutin concepts, but like not really, rather than just like making his own. But I don't know if I really saw that though. I just heard other people say. Oh, Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Again, this is something that might have been on my required for reading if I went to a certain school, maybe. I do know that a lot of people read it in high school, and I did actually buy this book a while back because I remember seeing it at a bookstore, like maybe like 7 years back, something, and like just bought it along with something else, I think, because I might have had but I didn't read it because I was like kind of like a little bit not intimidated, because I just haven't read anything by Hawthorne. I read, wait a second, I think, was it 2021 or no, it was 2020. I read the Scarlet Letter. Wait a second, no, not the Scarlet Letter. The Minister's Black Veil, which I did really like, but that's what kind of spurred me onto this, I think, was the it's like a little bit again on the nose. The Hester Prynne, the way it's written is like people have accused it of being flower language, overly kind of poetic and overly kind of dramatic, just like not getting to the point of like the affair and the infidelity in the 1600s puritanical New England. And having been to New England for work, I do remember being like, interestingly enough, I think I was like actually in Salem. I think there was actually on the port, I think, who's like actually, I believe Hawthorne was one of the port surveyors, I think, of that city. So during like obviously the 1800s, mid 1800s to late 1800s when he lived. But I just thought that was interesting because like you go to Salem, it's more namely for the witch trials and like the kind of museum, and like how they kind of turned it into a kind of a sick, almost fetishizing the idea of like the torture and all the thinking of a way to kind of turn it into another kind of commodity. Not to sound like a kind of an edgy anti-capitalist person, but I just thought it was kind of annoying that they had like little shops that were open, like gift shops and souvenirs of just like Salem witch trials and stuff. It's just like so tacky. But then again, they have like a lot of different things, like too, like you get any, like even like the most, the more, kind of, I guess, cultured societies, even up, I've been to certain places, maybe in Ireland, that had like souvenir shops too, but like they weren't like tacky though. They're pretty just decent, just trying to make, a living just like anybody else. But yeah, I did like the message of the Scarlet Letter though, like just forgiveness, and not, and that not being, it didn't, people have called it like kind of like, oh, it was like during the day it kind of caused, even then in the 1800s, like, it caused like a bit of a ruckus with and controversy just due to the people calling it like kind of sentimental, um and like sentimental and like sensual, yeah, like that's what I'm looking for. Just like, oh, they thought it was like too promiscuous, like it was like celebrating promiscuity. It's just like, no, it was just more or less just kind of like discussing it, um, albeit in flowery language that was really hard to read. The Broom of the System too. David Foster Wallace, was, yeah, his first book. Very, I gotta do a review separate of this, but yeah, very kind of satirical in one sense, philosophical, almost an analytic kind of, mentioning Wittgenstein too, but also kind of before he developed his style. But it was a pretty impressive first book for somebody who was like, what, 24 when it came out, right? 25. So yeah, I mean, I do remember this kind of unconsciously inspired one of my own first kind of books as well, taking on like a different kind of route rather than just looking toward the classic kind of literature and like looking towards, like see what other people were, other kind of voices in literature in different time periods were doing, rather than just, but yeah, I thought it was funny in one sense, because there's like one character that was like so fat that there were like, it got like, it was that they, but he was describing his like overeating as like this philosophical concept. Like he was like weird. He was, I can't remember the name of the character, but he was like, he was eating as a way of ever distending this thing of like time and space and being, like his making his subjective thing even more of an objective kind of thing. So like he was like trying to make it like as, I can't remember like what exactly it was, but it was, yeah, it was I thought it was kind of funny. And then, so Conversation with the Eye is just my own novel which I read, which I probably would have had to read at least like probably 3 times over just to, to edit it, all that stuff. And The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, another Huxley book. I heard that he was talking about, so I heard there's like a video recording of him, well, not video, but just a recording on YouTube. You can look up, if it's still there, probably is, of him like Aldous Huxley on acid, I think, and it's him basically just talking about like how he felt, and he was like, I feel kind of dreamy in this, and then he basically in The Doors of Perception he talks more about that, and this is actually the book that I have to mention it because it came up, or the Doors, the band, the Doors, Jim Morrison, that basically took the first 2, letters of the the title of the novel and inspired their own thing, and obviously they were into psychedelic type stuff too, especially since it's like the 60s and 70s. So, The Catcher in the Rye, again, by J.D. Salinger. Again, another required reading thing that I never got around to reading until now. I really liked it. I mean, yeah, this idea of like coming of age, going through all this stuff, like being, the main character is basically trying to, what is he, 15 in this? He's just, Holden, right? Yeah. Is just trying to make it through day to day and being authentic and true to himself, and like doing that, he's just kind of in a sense, he has to kind of push himself away from, or he sees that he kind of has to do that in order to kind of, you know, put his foot down and just like, just stick to his guts on certain things. And like, I really did identify certain parts, like when he was like with the one like prostitute. I think she was like, he was doing it, that he was like, why should I do this if I don't feel like this is something I want to do? Like, why? Just because like a billion other guys this is the way that a billion other guys came to know a woman. Like, okay, fine, whatever, but why should I join their ranks? So yeah, I thought that was a pretty good kind of message of just sticking to your guns on certain things. And Hear the Wind Sing by Haruki Murakami. I believe that was one of his first novel. I can't quite remember. I do remember, I think it was in Colorado in the Rockies, listening to it, and like there's like a snowstorm. I was just waiting in our hotel room on this cabin area. It was a really nice little kind of resort cabin. And I was just listening to it, and I was like, or reading. I think I read it. Yeah. I really liked it. It was like, like a little bit kind of establishing a certain really quick read too. It's more of a short story, if to be honest, but it doesn't take away. I think it establishes his style, little markers of his style that are gonna show up later on, and especially since it gives me a little hope, knowing that he wrote that when he was 29. And before that, he just lived like an average everyday life. Like, he wasn't like one of those kind of, I think like with like Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein when she was 20, 21. Like you hear about a lot of, precocious, above, ahead of their class kind of people. Like, and for me, I was never like head of my class. I mean, I was actually homeschooled for a good portion of my education, and like I was more or less in this, like there was virtual classes too, but even with that, I never was like super ambitious. I just remember excelling. There were, in most in like literature and like math. Just sometimes I was barely scraping by. Other times, like I failed certain tests and like exams that were like defining that I had to get a passing grade and stuff. But other times, like I didn't. Like, I was just able to kind of skirt by. But for the most part, it was like, literature was like a kind of natural thing that I was like, but it wasn't something I was like super good at. Like, I wasn't writing right away. I guess like some stuff I wrote like when I was like 15 or so. Like, I wrote like a short story that was kind of jokey. That aside from that, there was not very much until my early 20s. But yeah, I think Murakami is probably one of my biggest influence, I think, as far as like writers who are still like alive, like, and hearing him talk highly of other authors. I love like Dostoevsky or Kafka to the point where he writes Kafka on the Shore. Yeah, I think he's impressive in his own right, and he's like, he's not trying to, you get the sense that, like, he's not like super reclusive, but you get the sense that he's not trying to like impress anybody, and like he's like, but at the same time he's like very, he's a enormous talent, obviously, but at the same time he's not, I don't know, like he's not like this intimidating kind of like story of like, oh, he's so, he was like, maxed out of all these classes in college and stuff like that. I think he's like kind of has a bit of an everyman's kind of start too, like of just like owning this jazz club bar in like his 20s and closing that during the night and stuff, and then getting into running when he was like, I think around the same time he started writing. He was like, I did that, in I think I read that during 2021. It was sure. But it was what I talk about when I talk about running, which is obviously, take on what do we talk about when we talk about God by Raymond Carver? Oh. I'm sorry, what do we talk about when we talk about love? I'm sorry. There's so many different variations. I think somebody else wrote a book on like God or something and used that. So the next one I read was Nichevska Nezemnova by Dostoevsky. Was in, I think it was unfinished, or that Dostoevsky never got around to tying up, and I really loved it. It's probably one of my favorite kind of shorter works by Dostoevsky. A little over 100 pages. I remember reading it really quickly, like on a afternoon, and like change. I think like the next day I finished it, and it was basically, yeah, it was like this again, like the depiction of poverty is like so brutally honest in that classic Dostoevsky kind of Russian fashion of but I think what I love most is that the author, there's the narrator, I think Nikesh is adopts in Cheska, and there's like a lot of love and compassion, but there was another, I think his for the I think the her biological father was like a violinist, and like it talked about how he would practice for hours and hours, and like and he was like really good, but then there were times when he'd be so like disgusted by the violin, and that he would like drop it for just weeks, even months on end, I think. And that kind of signifies how I almost see certain people, like certain talents. Like I'm reading The Loser by Thomas Bernhard right now, and it's really great. But I'm literally like 15 pages into it, and like he talks about like Glenn Gould, and like how, actually I don't think it says this in his book, but I remember hearing about Glenn Gould not really liking practicing that much. Like you get the sense where he's like sometimes, like I think in one interview, Gould said that he like stopped practicing for like 2 to 3 weeks and then felt horrible about it, but it was like kind of put things into perspective, I guess, because I think there's like a maddening quality to, and this is coming from my attempts at practicing piano, which are very, very slim, knock on wood. Yeah, just one for context. Yeah, there is a piano there. I try to, but I'm not super crazy. I'm more like anywhere from like 15 minutes to like an hour. Hour tops. I'd be surprised if I'm on it that long. But yeah, because I'm also, to be fair, there's guitar too. Sorry, there's so many different things I'm talking about, trying to squeeze in. But yeah, there's a sense of like, I think with The Loser by Thomas Bernhard, where he's like, I find interesting is that like Glenn Gould is like outmatched everybody so easily because he has like this enormous talent, and like everybody, they don't know what to do. So like one of them is like right off the bat is like considering suicide. He's like, it's the only way. But and like this idea that Glenn Gould actually died, not because of suicide, but just because of, I think, cancer, right? It was at the age of 50, but he like put so much out there. But yeah, I just with Natasha Noviani, that was like kind of this. I thought there was an interesting depiction of like talent and like the cost of it, like the romantic idea of talent too. Like this, it was romantic times too, like as in the capital R romantics. Like the music of Grieg or Haydn or Handel, or not Handel. Handel was more Baroque. But yeah, all these other different composers that were viewing things subjectively and like with just like strictly just a passion for the art. All right, after that was Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad. I think as often I heard, it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out that Apocalypse Now is based off of Heart of Darkness by Conrad, and I had heard of Joseph Conrad showing up in my ranks as you do when you get interested in this kind of literature, and I was like, oh well, he was a Polish / British, because I think he emigrated over to, and also changed that really super confusing kind of Polish last name where you get like Chiki Nakachiki, you get like Szkajmenayer, or you get, I think, Jan Szkajmenayer, or you get Krzysztof Kieslowski. It's like you looks like the language is like kind of like somebody like took a butchering thing and took like in the best way, because I love Polish people. It's not like but yeah, Heart of Darkness explores this, the mentally unstable Colonel Kurtz, who's just who a shipment of people are going on this kind of Odyssey type quest to seek him down and to terminate with what was that they said in the movie Apocalypse Now. It's like terminate with extreme prejudice. But in this case, the novel was like different. Obviously, I think it focused a little bit more on the kind of, obviously the novel's not set in Vietnam. It's 19, what was it, early 1900s, right on the cusp of the century, I believe, on the dawn of the 20th century, and I think it deals more with like, I can't remember where the island is that they're trying to find this colonel, but it's like definitely kind of some weird like penal colony or something. Anyway, but yeah, I want to read more. I think I read Lord Jim too, which deals with kind of just derelict sailors and like military kind of people that are far out of their conduct and far out of their zone, like are just completely off the rockers, like, because you think of the military, you think of like structure and order and all this stuff, and then you think about war in general, and war is like the complete antithesis to that. So you get people like shell shock, and just obviously just name obvious side effect, or you get these mental illnesses that really take a toll on you, like Septimus Bourne Smith and Mrs. Dalloway, committing suicide because of that. And it's just like, like there's so much. I think you kind of have to, almost in a way, be a bit of a Judge Holden and do like this weird dance with death kind of thing, and just like embrace the wild kind of thing, and just in order to kind of, but to like convince yourself of, if I don't know, of just anything, of the worthwhileness or the meaning of life, I guess. The Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller. I really did like this. I think I read it on a plane back from Chicago. Oh, I'm sorry, not Chicago. Colorado. And I was like reading it on a Kindle, which I don't particularly like, but I did like Arthur Miller, his depiction of, and especially since it's a play too, that it's told, kind of in a format of, scene structure and acts and all that. So there's a lot of direction given to it. It's like, and then, so and so goes here, and then Happy goes here, and then Willy Loman, like the idea that I really liked about this too. Like, remember hearing about the plot, like maybe I think I saw scenes of of certain versions of it, modern day versions, because it came out in the 40s, late 40s. So it's like kind of a post-war era, not piece of art that was very telling, I guess, of like, this idea of like the death of the salesman. It's almost existential too, with William Loman, because he's said to have been kind of a low man, I think was like kind of the semi-intent of Arthur Miller. But yeah, I thought that was interesting how he combines this idea of like death, which is almost universal, and like it's incoming for all of us. It's basically a given, in the bag for everybody. But it's also the death of a salesman. Like he lived, like going door to door, like in New York, I guess. He was, and he has these two sons that are both of whom are like really buoyant and positive, and like basically, Willy Loman's sons, I think it's like Happy Loman, and I can't remember the name of the other one. Sort of the B, but yeah, he lives this life, and it's like basically, as so kind of similar to what happens with the death of Ivan Ilyich too. Is like you live your life not really thinking or paying attention to the bigger questions, and then suddenly it hits you late in life, and you're just like, wait, why did I waste time doing this? I'm going everywhere, and that's what kind of happens with Loman too. But anyway, not to give too far away, because I would like to actually just review that later on when I get a chance. Oh, The Moth, Ivan Goncharov. I believe I did this one too. Again, classic Russian social commentary for the superfluous man too. The concept of somebody not doing anything at all is just excess. In his day-to-day life is just the thing that I found funny about it was like it dramatized him, just the mere act of him getting up from his bed to like the sofa was like a 3-act structure. And I thought that was funny because it was like, it like had all the drama of Greek tragedy It's very almost postmodern because I feel like postmodern, post-ironic kind of humor. I feel like there's movies that are actually kind of similar in a sense, like that nothing might maybe not much has changed, you know. But yeah, there's movies like I think it's called Locke with Hardy. It was years since I've seen this movie, but it's like, you know, it takes all of it takes place within a car with him, this construction guy, you know, like supervisor who's trying to oversee like a pour, an incoming like concrete pour, and then all of a sudden like all this stuff just starts happening, um, just starts like laying on it, like just like his wife is like finds out about his affair, I think, and then like people like about to like pour the concrete or like not, there's like lots of like contentions and people like not wanting to follow through and people are just kind of like flaking out on it. It's just like that entire thing. But it's all from the point of view of just his car and like him like on his kind of modern, because it's, you know, it's like a, it's in the 2010s I think, so it's like kind of his up to date kind of Bluetooth speakers and stuff. It's like kind of makes it ease of access. So, but yeah, there's I thought it was gonna be, in the war parts that were kind of boring, but like in the sense that, you know, you're telling a story that, you know, it's gonna be kind of like that. Like there's, if you have a movie that's like that, there's gonna be, I think there's only one scene change where it's like near the end of the movie, which, um, but yeah, I think when you make a movie like that, or like Birdman, the unexpected virtue of ignorance, also trying to adapt a what was it, Raymond Carver play, but yeah, there's with that too, like you face, I think with that there's like inevitable limitations of trying to get everything with one shot, or like it to your best, not or best, to the best of your ability, trying to piece and weave it together in a way that it looks like it's like shot, because it's almost like it doesn't have to, it's not like there's like this you know, religious like kind of obsessive devotion to making it like it has to be shot in one thing, because it's like it really doesn't matter. But like in the sense of film magic and movie magic, you are actually able to kind of like kind of play with certain things and editing and like film, make it kind of like, you know, segue to the next scene with like, you know, pointing up towards the ceiling, like I think it did. But yeah, like I think with anything, like you face kind of like limitations or people saying it's gimmicky, but I don't know. I thought it was an interesting movie, and I thought it just reminded me of Almov because it all takes place within like kind of one place, like one. But with Almov, there's more. There's definitely more character development. You see Oblomov kind of, he's disappearing into dreams, and he's, you know, he's very daydreamy. He's just like living his life through. He's like he wants to. He's such a fan of sleeping and idle, kind of just sitting around and sedentariness, that his whole entire like dream is just kind of, it's still like a dream, like it's in his head, and it's all like it's all the contents of his sleep that he finds the most compelling, I guess, stuff. That's why I find it quite fascinating. I've got to read more Goncharov. I do get him mixed up with Turgenev too, which I guess is a kind of understandable mistake. Anyway, so On the Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Like with Spinoza, I felt like I had to engage with his philosophical works, just like I had to do with Rousseau, just because, I don't know, like I just wanted to get an idea of what he was getting at, because I heard different people contrasting Rousseau's stuff with Thomas Hobbes, with Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which is one of his famous works, and like his theory on the social contract was different, wildly different, which is why they get brought up a lot. Although I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau is actually born almost like a generation or two later, I think, from Thomas Hobbes. So it's not like they both engaged with each other eye to eye. But they definitely did, I think, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau mentions, you know, Thomas Hobbes, I think, a lot. And he's like trying to kind of put his piece of, you know, the puzzle on like what the social contract was. So basically the social contract is like, you know, it's basically what autonomous people, human beings, we were born with, that a certain right away we have to contend with like the state and the government and powers of that be, and like it basically, in order to actually successfully navigate this, we have to come up with something. Like, even if it's right off the bat, like, even if you're like a what's the name of the people, like sovereign nations, where you're like, there is a different kind of contract where you have to, where we are all anti-government, anti this, and we have our own name or whatever, it's written like this, and like that whole silly thing. Even if you stick to your guns, and that, like, that requires you to kind of be in the know and to kind of get in the nitty gritty and like stick to that and be like, okay, well, I guess we're gonna be the first monkey shot into space and our get ourselves shot, and then when we get pulled over at a traffic stop by a really overly paranoid cop, because that's what cops do. They're just trained to be paranoid. Anyway, but yeah, this is the interesting thing, is that there's a way that we can. I think what Rousseau is that man is, one of his famous sayings is just man everywhere is born. Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. I think is the verbatim. And I think that's actually slightly, not fully reflective of his philosophy. I could be wrong, but I did hear that Rousseau is also kind of something of a. That almost sounds like kind of like it's been twisted into kind of a tree hugger kind of. Hey man, just everybody's free, man. We're all free. Like what? In a way, it's kind of understandable, I guess. But at the same time, it's like it makes me think. That it makes me kind of consider the fact that I don't know, like there's how much I really want to say about this, but it's with Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes. He thought like the opposite, like people have a duty to give back, I think, right? It was Hobbes was like there are certain things that because the social organism of the government is this thing that's like kind of protean and ever changing. That's in part, like, for example, the post office is something that's totally free, and it's like relying off taxpayer. I think even some countries it's not even taxpayer money, but it's just like a government thing. It's just they not subsidies, but like it's like they basically make room for it. They make money and they donate to it, and they make it exist no matter what, without anybody being, they rely off of donations or stamps or like little things, like tiny little things, and they kind of accumulate it and they make it work somehow, almost in a Wu Wei kind of fashion, interestingly enough. But in another sense, it's like I think Hobbes was saying that, like, I don't know if you have to actually read his stuff, but I think his theory was that we have to give back. We are in certain things. Curiosity to him was lust of the mind. I think, we can't have, people overly getting carried away with their ideas, and you have to be, like, strictly ordained to some degree of fealty to our governments. Like, we have to give back to them in a transaction of reciprocity, because you're born in this world. It's like, hey, it's tough luck. This is which is a kind of depressing way, and I think it's depressing kind of way, because that kind of makes you abide in certain things that you might come back to haunt you, or might things like you could be giving away your rights. You could be giving away certain things that you don't. I think I err on the side of Rousseau, but at the same time, Rousseau is also kind of a little bit more religious. He was also late, at least at some point. I'm not sure if he was born into it or not, but I think it was like that kind of based. Like he did get. It was actually more of a weird, like, not parliamentary democratic kind of thing, but it was more of almost like a religious. It's weird because he says these things like man is born free. We can't be in chains to the state. We have to make them autonomous. Like and this idea of the noble savage is actually a different idea that Rousseau, I don't think, even had anything to do with. I could be wrong, but I think like people just kind of lifted from Rousseau and said, oh, the noble savage is something he did. But like this idea that the savage out somewhere in Pocahontas land is kind of like this inherently when it comes down to it is perfectly fine and noble in their own ways, even if they're kind of rough around the edges. And I think with the problem with that is moral relativism. You get into this thing where you're like, well, okay, what about certain things like honor killings, or like the enslavement of women, or making turning them into, like doing them, making them do unspeakable, inhumane things, and you're like, well, that's like that's just their way. It's just like, hey, that's just their own way of like, there's truth, like that's their truth. By the way, I hate that term, like living your truth, like living your truth, like just because like, hey, maybe the Unabomber was living his truth in his way. I don't know, like it's just like it kind of puts this expectation in kind of like not an expectation, but it's like I think living your truth, especially in this kind of new age hip way, kind of just makes it doesn't it just makes for disaster. I think like a lot of the times. I'm not saying like there's anything wrong with being open minded and like trying that out and like knowing or being who you are in a Nietzschean way, right? Like that this idea of like, hey, we can all form our own values and all that. But anyway, there's I'm gonna finish what I did in March on the social contract. So I've got to reread and like kind of look more into that because I am rusty on that. Motes and Beams, a neo-Jungian theory of personality by Michael Pyrrhus, which I have on my shelf somewhere. I don't know if I'm gonna get into the dirt on that. That's a on the issue of like the Jungian kind of psychology, not just that, but also his personality theory and his theory of, on the psychological types, which I could get into, but I just don't feel like getting into it now because there's like a lot of different weeds and stuff I have problems with it. Like I remember following it for some time and thinking highly of certain things, like at least as far back when I first heard at like when I was like 17 or 18, a friend of a friend kind of it's how it usually starts. It starts out with the test itself, like the Myers-Briggs kind of 16 personality kind of little questionnaire that people take, and I wasn't, I took it and I was like, oh, this describes me too, but then I also took it again and it was like a different result, so it was like kind of like, I don't know, it was just like it wasn't to the extent that some people are like very like this like opposite, like I got 5 different types or 6 or different, but I did think there's a lot of kind of, what's the word? I think it's the Barnum effect or the Fourier effect. I believe it's this idea, basically, that if you are this description, like, oh, like this describes me literally, or literally me. I think the Barnum effect is basically like a psychological kind of fallacy that people that I did too, and that still do in some ways take part in, which is basically that you see yourself in a very vague, purposely written vague thing, like with like horoscopes, which is I can't stand horoscopes, or this thing of like, ooh, like Tauruses are this, they're mysterious, or like I'm a Virgo, and Virgos are scholarly, yet they're also very outgoing, but they're also very shy too, and you're like thinking those are just two, like they can't go together. I'm not saying well that's what. So I love Jung. I love reading his stuff. He's helped me enormously in my journey of self knowledge and has profound insights into the self. And he's helped out a lot. But when it comes to this kind of idea, it's not like I'm trying to write it off as, oh, it's just like astrology for dummies, or I'm sorry, not astrology for kind of smarter people or whatever that I've heard online. I'm just coming at it from a listen, like not even Occam's razor where like you keep making assumptions, because there are things where it's more so measured on, like, I think Jung had said himself that he was in the psychological types, which I remember reading around this year or two, I believe. He even said that like he had accumulated evidence, but there was a lack of like empirical data. Like there wasn't lab tests or results like measured in cognitive functions and like extroversion and introversion. Like you can't measure. Well, I guess there's been psychologists that have measured like input, like the response to stimuli, and they showed that basically extroverts on average tend to have a higher threshold for like responding to different things, like stimuli and um, maintaining like a high kind of engaging with that type of atmosphere of just being outgoing and doing things or adrenaline rush type of things. And that's not to say that introverts can't do that. Like I'm an introvert, believe it or not. Like it's probably the first thing you notice about me, right? But like it almost characteristically. But it doesn't mean like I can't. Like I don't. Doesn't mean I negates me from having a social life or having a group of friends or having people. And that's what I like Jung is because he's like, okay, well, there's a function that everybody has is a either introvert or your extroverted function, right? It's like I think with him it was like the four main types of like I don't know, it's like judging, thinking, feeling, judging, perceiving. Or I'm sorry, not judging, thinking, feeling, intuition, sensation. So meaning like sensation, like you're more open to having, more inclined to be pragmatic in the in what's the word, immersed, I guess, in like there's a sense of like not anti curiosity, but just like you're more less of an ideas person and more of a pragmatic kind of reality person. Like I'm a realist. Um, that's not to say that people who are sensation type can't have ideas, and that people who are intuitive can't have sensations or enjoy sensuous sensual materialistic things. That just means that generally you have a preference, is what they're called. I think Jung says in so many words. But with the whole thing with like I don't get is that it's like almost like blocky, and that it's like very, it's like you're either or. It's like because then ambivert. It's like kind of like the thing. It's like don't say, how dare you say ambivert in like this community. But I think like ambiversion is like it's not. I think it's like an attempt to kind of find a common basis, like because it's this idea of like, listen, there are people, even people like who get categorized as extroverts who have a lot of like introverted tendencies too. Like they're very maybe close guarded, and then there's other things too that I got into, like the Enneagram too. This like this 9 different kind of things, like the three, split into 3 parts. The heart triad and head triad and the gut triad, I think. So like that, I found that to be pretty helpful too, and like kind of that's almost like how you use your cognitive functions, and in a sense like that's kind of that has its own issues too. I think is that people cling a little bit too much to things. I'm like, oh my gosh, this so describes me. I'm such a type 6. That's why I can't do this, or like that's why I can't. And it's like they let it kind of make up their mind. Like they let it kind of they make it almost like this, as if this thing. And they read a lot of Claudio Naranjo, I think it's pronounced. Who I've yet to read a lot. I think I've only read like bits and pieces, but like I think he has pretty good things, and I just have this an issue with people. They devote so much time, and I'm guilty of this too, obviously. Because how else would I know about this stuff? Of going down the rabbit hole of like reading about Jung, which is good, which is fine, because I think Jung says too, like, hey, don't stay in your head about all this either, if that's your instinct. Like you have to. There's individuation is another process of like living out the shadow side that you might be, and to laugh at it like you did in the Red Book, the Liber Secundus of, I think it's called the Seven Servants of the Dead, I think. That was, like very intense stuff. And he was like, how do I contend with the shadow? Because like the shadow could be so horrible, like this other side of me that I don't like, because I could repress it, I could do this. But at the end of the story, he chooses to laugh at it because he's not trying to take that side of himself so seriously. So yeah, I think in that sense, that's what I'm trying to do, is like these things have taught me certain things of how like, oh, I can be this, and I can actually write better in a sense, in one sense, because now that I'm not saying I've unlocked anything that other people don't know, but because it also has lots of limitations and like lots of different downfalls, but it's also helped me become a better writer, only insofar that it's made me more curious about how people work. So then I can also do a thing where rather than limiting myself and being like, hey, I'm just going to be, because I am let's say more, I'm more open to being like, let's say, progressive and I'm liberal, let's say, or whatever. I'm not saying I am necessarily, but what happens is you end up with the second you categorize yourself, you limit yourself. So like then you can't actually write in a free and genuine, like as freely and open minded as you want, because you're like, well, if I make up my mind, I'm like, well, I'm just a neoconservative guy. I believe in God and the Bible. It's all I care about. Then I just don't. I just give up writing. I'm just like, whatever. I'm just gonna kind of live the quiet kind of Christian kind of um, homestead life, which is fine. I have good friends, and I come from a Christian family too, and I have no issue with Christianity as insofar as that it can be a powerful spiritual kind of gluing together social cohesion too, because you need that kind of ritual aspect too. Like to say Jordan Peterson says something like this too. Well, as much as downfalls he says, but I'm not sure if I want to get in the dirt on his whole thing yet. Jordan Peterson, pretty cool, and then he does this thing, and then it's like the benzene addiction is like I totally understand that it was just depression. Depression can be a pretty family kind of thing. It was a familial thing with him too, I think, with the clinical kind of side. And then he was also dealing with like a lot of high stake situations with people that had stuff like that. So I don't think it's like saying like in order to be a chef, you have to learn, you have to like be the top of your game all the time. Like in order to be a chef, like you can only eat really good food or something like that. It just like makes no sense. But like I think like in him being a psychologist, like he had moments where he looked too far into certain things, or he put too much stake in the kind of in the Marxist kind of in that anti-Marxist, or in kind of like almost a not McCarthyian, but like not even I don't want to write it off as Red Scare, but it seemed like Peterson was going a little bit too far down the road of like, oh, like I'm seeing ghosts of Marx and this and that, and like Marx is like, he's like, and then meanwhile it's like Slavov Zizek is just like, well, wait, what is this like you're talking about? Like what? Like I don't see like what you're talking like this as an embodiment of actual Marxist ideology of people going out and doing these things like that, like committing atrocities in the name. But I do get that he's paranoid about certain things, like it could be Solzhenitsyn, it could be Ordinary Men, a great book by Christopher Browning he recommended, where it's like you do these things in the name, in the blind name of a higher ideology that, and yeah, it's just like, anyway. So anyway, I'm just gonna stop right there for now, because I'm getting tired. I'm just gonna be honest, and I'll continue on tomorrow. And I said this wasn't gonna take all that long, and here I am. Anyway, so yeah, I'm gonna try to maybe make a part two, because like I guess it's not really no point in trying to combine the two of these. I guess I could do that, but I don't know. We'll see. But if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.